Welcome to the Inspiring Welsh Schools podcast, a company led by teachers and inspiring the future. Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoy our episodes, don't forget to like, follow, and share our podcast so that more educators across Wales can join the conversation. Your support helps us grow and continue creating professional dialogues that matter. In this episode, we are going to take an extended look at how the curriculum for Wales frames assessment. Specifically, we'll be discussing two central ideas: assessment for learning and assessment of learning. We'll unpack what the curriculum actually says about these concepts, and then move into some practical thinking about how schools, each working within their own unique contexts, might choose to implement these principles. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for this episode. The aim of this episode is not to tell you that there is one correct way to do assessment under the new curriculum. Instead, the goal is to open up a professional dialogue, a chance to reflect, to consider different approaches, and to think about what makes sense in your own setting. Schools across Wales vary enormously in size, demographics, resources, language medium, and prior practice. So while the principles set out in the curriculum are shared, the way they are put into action will inevitably differ. The curriculum for Wales is clear that assessment is not an add-on, not a separate track running alongside the curriculum, and certainly not just a mechanism for accountability. Instead, assessment is built into the very fabric of learning. Its purpose is to support each learner to make progress. That means assessment is meant to guide teaching, to give learners insight into their own development, and to provide schools and families with a clear sense of where a child is and where they are heading. This represents a significant cultural shift from earlier systems. In the past, assessment often leaned heavily towards generating levels, grades, or scores, numbers that were sometimes used more to satisfy external requirements than to genuinely help learning. The curriculum for Wales does not deny the need for accountability or for capturing achievement, but it firmly recenters the conversation on learning. It asks us to think less about what percentage did this pupil achieve, and more about what do they understand now and what do they need to work on next. Let's begin by clarifying the two broad categories of assessment. Assessment for learning, sometimes called formative assessment, is about using information gathered during the process of learning to shape what happens next. It is dynamic, responsive, and closely tied to the flow of teaching. Think about questioning, feedback, learning conversations, or even just noticing a pattern of errors in pupils' work and adjusting accordingly. That is assessment for learning. The curriculum for Wales positions this kind of assessment as essential, something that should be embedded in everyday classroom practice rather than bolted on as an extra. Assessment of learning, sometimes called summative assessment, happens at a particular point in time to provide a snapshot of achievement. This might be at the end of a unit, a term, or a year. It could take the form of a test, a project, a presentation, or a moderated judgment of a portfolio of work. The key here is that assessment of learning is not being abolished or dismissed. Instead, the curriculum for Wales challenges schools to think carefully about the purpose of summative assessment, and to avoid it becoming the dominant force that shapes everything else. And that leads us into one of the most important principles: assessment should be purposeful. This idea is central, and it runs throughout the framework. Purposeful assessment means that every activity related to assessment should serve a clear and useful function. Teachers are encouraged to ask themselves, what is the purpose of this assessment? Who is it for? And how will the information be used? These three questions sit at the heart of the whole philosophy. Let's unpack them more deeply. First, what is the purpose? Is the aim to check whether pupils have understood a key idea? Is it to provide evidence of progress over time? Is it to inform reporting to parents or to help with transition to the next phase of learning? If the purpose is clear, the assessment is justified. If the purpose is vague or absent, then the curriculum for Wales encourages us to think again. For example, if a school sets a test purely because it's what we've always done in March, without a clear idea of why that test matters, then the purpose is weak. Purposeful assessment challenges us to strip back anything that doesn't genuinely support learning. Second, who is it for? This is an important shift. Traditionally, assessments were often designed mainly for leaders, inspectors, or external agencies, but the curriculum for Wales emphasizes that assessment should primarily serve the learner and the teacher. If the assessment helps the learner understand their progress and helps the teacher know what to do next, then it is purposeful. If the assessment produces data that looks tidy on a spreadsheet but does little to help the learner, then it may not be worth the time. Of course, assessments can serve multiple audiences: learners, teachers, parents, leaders, but clarity on who the main audience is ensures that the design remains meaningful. Third, how will the information be used? This is the most practical question of all. If the data or evidence from the assessment is going to sit in a folder or be filed away without influencing teaching, planning, or support, then it may not be purposeful. But if the assessment directly informs next steps, whether that's reteaching a tricky concept, planning targeted intervention, or setting personal learning goals, then it has a clear role. Let's take some practical examples. Imagine a secondary English teacher setting a piece of extended writing. If the only outcome is a mark out of 25 and a grade, that may not tell the learner very much. But if the teacher uses the writing to identify common errors, gives targeted feedback, and then sets up peer review to help learners refine their work, the assessment becomes purposeful. It informs both teaching and learning. Or consider a primary school teacher using mini whiteboards to check answers during a maths lesson. If the teacher sees that half the class has misunderstood the method, they can pause and reteach immediately. That assessment is highly purposeful. It is quick, responsive, and directly impacts the direction of the lesson. Now let's look at a less purposeful example. A school might run a full set of mock examinations in November, January, and March, each requiring several days of lost teaching time. For some learners, this may be more stressful than helpful. If the purpose is to give experience of exam conditions, one set of mocks may be sufficient. Repeating them excessively risks tipping the balance from purposeful to unnecessary. The curriculum for Wales would encourage leaders to ask, what exactly is gained here, and is the gain proportionate to the time and pressure created? This principle of purposefulness can be liberating. It gives teachers and leaders the professional authority to question long-standing practices. It gives permission to stop doing things that are not helping learners progress. And it encourages innovation. Schools can design assessments that genuinely work for their learners, as long as they can justify the purpose. But being purposeful is not the only principle. The curriculum for Wales also stresses that assessment should be proportionate. That means it should not create unnecessary workload or bureaucracy. The risk in any system is that assessment becomes an industry of its own, producing mountains of data that teachers spend more time collecting than actually using. Proportionate assessment is about keeping it manageable, about making sure that the energy spent on assessment is matched by the value gained from it. Schools will need to think carefully here. For example, does every piece of work need to be marked in detail? Probably not. Purposeful and proportionate practice might mean deciding that some tasks are for practice, some are for peer assessment, and only some are for detailed teacher feedback. Similarly, schools might decide that formal reporting should happen at key points rather than after every assessment. So how might schools actually achieve all this in practice? The answer is, in many different ways depending on their context. Let's explore a few possibilities. One approach is the use of structured learning conversations. These are dialogues between teacher and learner that go beyond the tick-box approach. In a learning conversation, the teacher and learner reflect together on what has gone well, what still needs work, and what the next steps should be. This aligns with assessment for learning because it helps the learner to understand their progress in real time. It is purposeful because it clearly informs both teaching and learning. And it is proportionate because it does not require lengthy written comments for every piece of work. It focuses instead on meaningful dialogue. Another approach is self-assessment and peer assessment. These practices encourage learners to take greater responsibility for their progress. Under the curriculum for Wales, one of the 4 purposes is to develop ambitious, capable learners who are ready to learn throughout their lives. Teaching learners how to assess themselves and others is part of that journey. Of course, this requires training. Learners need to know how to give constructive feedback, how to reflect honestly, and how to act on what they notice. But when done well, it can be powerful and purposeful. Digital technology also offers opportunities. Many schools already use online platforms where learners can upload work, receive comments, and track progress over time. These systems can provide a rich record of learning, visible to learners, teachers, and parents. They can make assessment more immediate, and in some cases reduce workload. But context matters. A digitally confident school with strong infrastructure might find this transformative, while another school with limited access might find simpler paper-based methods more realistic. The curriculum for Wales is flexible here. It is the principles that matter, not the specific tools. When we think about assessment of learning, there are also many routes schools might take. Some will continue to use periodic tests, but perhaps in a lighter touch way, integrated with the flow of teaching rather than standing apart. Others may rely more on portfolios, projects, or moderated judgments of ongoing work. The curriculum for Wales gives schools the freedom to choose, as long as the approach is purposeful, proportionate, and consistent. That word consistency brings us to moderation. If schools are going to move away from standardized tests as the main measure of progress, then teachers need to feel confident that their judgments are fair and aligned. Moderation involves teachers coming together, looking at samples of work, and discussing standards. It is a collaborative process that builds shared understanding of what progression looks like. Moderation takes time, but it is a vital piece of the puzzle. Without it, the risk is that judgments vary too widely. With it, schools can be confident that their assessments are both reliable and purposeful. Reporting to parents and carers is another area where schools will need to think carefully. Under the new curriculum, reports are expected to move away from simple grades or levels, and instead focus more on narrative descriptions of progress, strengths, and next steps. This represents a significant shift for many families, who may be used to seeing numbers or letters. Clear communication will be key. Parents and carers need to understand what the new style of reporting means, and how they can use it to support their child's learning. Done well, this can lead to richer conversations at home, with learners more involved in explaining their own progress. Of course, challenges remain. One challenge is time. Teachers already juggle heavy workloads, and embedding new approaches to assessment requires professional learning, collaboration, and space for reflection. Leaders will need to be mindful of this and look for ways to integrate assessment changes without overwhelming staff. That might mean streamlining existing practices, removing duplication, or prioritizing high-value activities over lower-value ones. Another challenge is culture. In some schools or among some stakeholders, there may still be an expectation that assessment means tests, grades, or percentages. Shifting that mindset will take time. It will require ongoing communication about the purpose of assessment under the curriculum for Wales, and reassurance that meaningful assessment does not mean lowering standards, it means raising the focus on real learning. Equity is also a challenge. The curriculum for Wales places a strong emphasis on equity and inclusion. That means assessments must be accessible to all learners, including those with additional learning needs. Schools will need to think carefully about how they design tasks, how they offer support, and how they capture progress in ways that reflect each learner's abilities and potential. Assessment should not disadvantage learners who struggle with traditional written formats, for example. Instead, it should open up multiple ways of showing progress. In summary, the curriculum for Wales frames assessment as something that should empower learners and teachers, not restrict them. Assessment for learning and assessment of learning are not competing ideas, they are complementary. The central message is that assessment should always be purposeful, proportionate, and supportive of progression. The exact methods will vary from school to school, but the principles remain constant. For teachers, the key is to focus on what matters most, helping learners understand where they are in their learning, where they need to go next, and how they can get there. Whether that is through feedback, learning conversations, peer assessment, digital portfolios, moderated judgments, or reporting to parents, the guiding question should always be, does this assessment genuinely support learning? If the answer is yes, then it belongs. If the answer is no, then it may be time to reconsider. Thank you for listening to today's extended discussion on assessment within the curriculum for Wales. I hope this has given you a deeper understanding of the principles, more ideas for practice, and perhaps some reassurance that while the journey is complex, the direction is clear. Each school will find its own way, but with purposeful and proportionate assessment at the heart, the focus will always remain where it should, on supporting the progress of every learner. Thank you for listening to today's extended discussion on assessment within the curriculum for Wales. We hope it has given you a deeper understanding of the principles, more ideas for practice, and perhaps some reassurance that while the journey is complex, the direction is clear. This has been the Inspiring Welsh Schools podcast, a company led by teachers and inspiring the future. Make sure you like, follow, and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll continue to explore the ideas shaping Welsh education, bringing you professional conversations that are practical, relevant, and inspiring. Tune in next time, and until then, keep reflecting, keep sharing, and keep inspiring the learners in your classrooms. If you're an educational company and would like to advertise with us or sponsor a future episode of the Inspiring Welsh Schools podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Partnering with us is a great way to connect with schools and teachers across Wales, and to showcase how your work supports education. You can get in touch directly by emailing us at inspiringwelshschools@gmail.com.